With me tonight is James Klein. He is Assistant Professor of History at Del Mar College in Corpus Christi, Texas, and his book, Grappling with Demon Rum, The Cultural Struggle Over Liquor in Early Oklahoma, is a finalist for the 2009 Oklahoma Book Awards. And I'm going to ask you my favorite question, which is, what inspired you to write about demon rum?
I was interested in liquor prohibition for a number of years before I began writing the book, back into the 1980s yet. When I went through an undergraduate program and actually the master's degree program up at the University of Iowa. And I began researching it up there in the upper Midwest, in Iowa and in Wisconsin. And then when I entered graduate school at Oklahoma State University in 1998, I determined to kind of shift emphasis geographically, still staying in the same topic, but shifted to Oklahoma and found that it's really an ideal place to study a topic like liquor prohibition, because it cuts across so many different social lines, economic class lines. It divides people into different economic classes. It also touches on issues of race and ethnicity, gender as well. And so, since you have such a diverse population here in early Oklahoma, the first part of the 20th century, the largest at the time Native American population, obviously, but a fairly large African American population as well. A very large working class population also here, and then a large and growing middle class population. It seemed like an ideal laboratory within which to study those topics.
Mm-hmm. Well, and certainly we started out with prohibition when we became a state. That seems to have been a very important part of becoming our own state, at least according to some people.
That's right. That's right. Oklahoma is unique in that it's the only state to enter the Union as a dry state. Mm-hmm. And so it had liquor prohibition long before national prohibition comes in January of 1920, and then it had it long after national prohibition ended in 1933. Here in Oklahoma, at least hard liquor anyway, remained illegal until 1959. It was legalized then, and then there were still some restrictions placed on it. You couldn't purchase liquor by the drink and things of that sort until the 1980s, by 1986.
Mm-hmm. Well, what I found intriguing was that they actually left the prohibition part out of the Constitution in fear of Teddy Roosevelt.
Yeah, that's right. They're very much afraid of that, and they scheduled a referendum on liquor prohibition in, this would have been August, I guess, of 1907. There were two referenda that month. One on the Constitution, state Constitution, and one on liquor prohibition. And the Democratic Party, which was had kind of a narrow majority at the time, was concerned that if they incorporated the Prohibition Amendment into the Constitution, had people vote on both at the same time, that it might be enough to defeat the Constitution. And so they didn't want to chance that. But as it turned out, both of them passed.
Mm-hmm. And so we drank right up until the day.
Yeah, and that's what's really interesting about prohibition in Oklahoma as well, is that the things that the nation encountered in the 1920s that took everyone by surprise. Well, we didn't expect that from prohibition. You see that already here in Oklahoma in 1906, 1907, 1908. And so those who were kind of watching, I think maybe should have been, whether they were or not, should have been maybe aware of that and maybe prepared for a dramatic increase in crime, mm-hmm. and not just crime, but organized crime. You had the same thing happening here in Oklahoma, really on a smaller scale, as what you'd have later on in Chicago or in New York or elsewhere in Kansas City as well. And other problems associated with prohibition, like a backlog in the court system. You had that here in Oklahoma as well from the get-go. It took a great deal of time for them to kind of figure out exactly how this would be implemented as well. The fact that Indian Territory had been under federal control beforehand, and that the federal government had had banned the sale of liquor to Native Americans, further complicated things, and so it became a legal issue of who should be responsible for enforcing prohibition in the eastern part of Oklahoma, the area that had been Indian Territory. Should the federal officials be in charge of that, or the state and local officials? And typically, if you ask the state and local officials, they said, we think the federal people should be doing this. And the federal people said, we think the local people should be enforcing this instead. It was really difficult to do. It put enforcement officials in a tough spot.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I suspect that it led to a fair amount of corruption of local officials as well.
Yeah, there's a great deal of that. And There is a great deal of evidence of that. There's a man named William Creekmore, by 1915, really controlled somewhere between 2/3 and even 3/4 of the liquor being distributed throughout the entire state. He was kind of the boss of the liquor industry. Brought it in from Joplin, Missouri, and he provided a great deal of funding to some local officials in order to get them to not just leave him alone, but to get them to go after his competitors. You know, prohibition essentially deregulates the liquor industry entirely, so you can do anything. And Creekmore and a lot of his other competitors did as well. He is finally arrested, I think, and indicted, convicted even in 1915, but for jury tampering, not for liquor running.
Well, what I found fascinating about your book was your talking about the class situation. Lots of things have been talked about, liquor and prohibition and so on, but very little about, well, it was really kind of middle class against working class people. There were all these other elements that played into it, but that was in essence what the problem was.
Yeah, that's true. The common wisdom on prohibition amongst historians, I think even right now yet, is that it divided Americans along religious lines, that Roman Catholics and other ritualists, like some members of the Lutheran Church, the Jewish population, the Episcopal Church, tended to oppose prohibition, and those are the ones that tended to violate it, whereas the evangelicals, the pietists, groups like the Baptists, Southern Baptist Church in particular, Methodist Church, some of the Presbyterian Church, Congregational Church certainly tended to support it. And I see that same split here in Oklahoma, but what really struck me was when I began looking at that referendum from 1907, looking at the, having identified the size of the Catholic population in Oklahoma at the time, the size of the immigrant population, which is also traditionally seen as kind of a wet population. The immigrant population and Catholic population in Oklahoma are relatively small, and so I was expecting then when I went to the referendum numbers to see a huge majority in favor of prohibition, and I did not find that. It did pass by, I think, 51.3% to 48.7% or something like that. Very, very close, and so it became apparent that someone was voting wet in the state other than just Roman Catholics and immigrants. And that's what really got me started thinking about this. And as I started looking at how it was enforced afterward, it became apparent by looking through the papers of the early governors and the attorneys general that the real problem was in the oil patch around the Tulsa area, later on down by Ardmore as well, and then in the the mining areas in southeastern Oklahoma, in Cole County itself, and then up in the northeast part as well, in I guess the zinc mines up there around Miami.
Well, we've run out of time. I would love to talk more, but I want to thank you very much.
Sure. Thank you for having me.
James Klein has been here talking about his book, Grappling with Demon Rum. You can find it at your library and your favorite bookstore.